So good afternoon, folks. I think what we'll do is kick off now with our ultimate session of the Exchange Symposium for 2021. And it is a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Bentley Crudgington, who's the creative facilitator of the Animal Research Nexus. And Bentley is going to be speaking about an extraordinary project called the Slow Ritual of Care, Adapting in Times of Change. And there will be time for questions. We're aiming to wrap up at 3 o'clock. And so if anything occurs to you whilst Bentley is speaking, do please make a note in the chat, and then we'll loop around to those questions and have a dialogue then. So Bentley, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So I thought I would do a little introduction about me, the project, some other work that I did that the Slow Ritual of Care came from, and then sort of take you through the steps to try and show what it did or what I wanted it to do. So I'm a creative facilitator based in Manchester, and the project that I work on is called the Animal Research Nexus. So this is bringing the social scientists and social sciences and humanities to look at the broad concept of animal research, particularly the social construct of how that happens, how we are allowed to do animal research. And it's a big project. It's a collaborative award from the Wellcome Trust, and it's split between 5 institutes. So colleagues at Manchester look at the history and culture of animal research, particularly about the legislation, why the legislation changed in 1986 with the new legislation called ASPR, why that was necessary, who influenced it, and where it came from. And then my colleagues in Oxford look at species and spaces. So what happens when you change either one of those, either change the species or the spaces, and particularly how you move care when you move species or move spaces. So all of the things that you have in place, what happens when they change. And then we have my colleagues in Southampton who this work focus on looks at the materials and markets of animal research. So the animal, not only as a technology, but something that creates economies and markets around it. So who supplies it, how those animals move, what other sort of moral economies as well as financial economies happen around it, and what influences that has on welfare. Then I told you it's a big project. My other colleagues in Nottingham looks at the professional roles. So what professional roles has animal research created? And they're particularly focused on the named veterinary surgeon, who is the veterinary professional who is inside the laboratory, who oversees the welfare. And then finally, colleagues at Exeter, which is Gail Davies, looks at patient and public involvement. So when patients who are patient advocates are involved in feeding into research, what happens when those identities encounter animal research, and how to have those conversations. So I sit as a creative facilitator in a kind of 6th wedge, which is kind of communication and collaboration to help people work more collaboratively and more creatively. So I try and make the creative outputs from the research and have more creative ways to have conversations. So my colleagues in Southampton, the ones that looked at the material and markets, we wanted to do some work around that because first of all, there was no research about where the public thought research animals came from. And also we started off by talking to animal technologists, the people who care for animals, and talk to them about what they wanted people to know and what they wanted the research to do. So I ran a narrative framing workshop there. So we started at the procedure, the last procedure they did on an animal, and we looked at where that animal came from and then also what happened to that. So we wrote the complete arc of the animal journey, and that mapped out some of the research that my colleagues did in the social sciences and geography, looking at those movements. And then we wanted to sort of ask the public about where they thought mice had come from. So we made the mouse exchange, and I'll share a few slides with you now. So the mouse exchange is essentially setting up a table, and we invite people.
Bentley, I'm sorry to interrupt. At the moment, we've got your notes large and your screen of the mouse is small.
This should, hang on one second.
I think we've got your desktop, maybe.
I think, maybe we have different versions of Zoom, and I can't share my presentation in a window. Let's have a look.
I've now got your presentation full screen.
Okay, magic. Cool, thank you for that, because I wouldn't have spotted it. So the Mouse Exchange is a crafting activity we set up in different spaces, and it was a simple invitation to ask people to come and sit down and make a mouse with us. And in doing that crafting material, we started off the conversation by saying, have you ever thought about where laboratory mice came from? And then that conversation is completely directed by the participants. So they ask the questions and we kind of explore things together. So it was a shift away from normally animals or perhaps mentioned, or animal research is perhaps mentioned quickly as we talk about the products of research, about health benefits and health outcomes. So we wanted to center the animal in those discussions. So it was a curiosity-led workshop. We started off by making the whole mouse, so it would take about 20 minutes for a conversation. We then realized we spent so much of our time talking about crafting that we wanted to shortcut it. So we moved on to what we lovingly refer to as our mice pasties, or sometimes tacos. So by pre-making the bodies, we sort of shortcutted a lot of the craft work, so we could then concentrate on the discussion. So then people added the sensory organs, the ears, the eyes, and the whiskers, and we talked about it. But then I realized that we could do more with other kind of props as a kind of signpost to sort of further narratives that we could talk about. So the next kind of thing I introduced was the biobank, which was a big old picnic hamper that we layered with ice, and some of the mouse bodies, the pasties, were kept in the biobank. So when people sat down, we sent them to the biobank to go and get enough bodies for the table to make mice, and then we put them in the little incubator to revive them or to defrost them. So I was talking about how some mice, are stored, or embryos are stored, and so some bodies and some lives are in stasis within the lab, and some of them return there as this kind of biobank, as an archive of laboratory life. So it's another way of starting the conversation, and then we would build through the Mouse Exchange. And then the second element we added was this hole punch, to punch a hole in the ear. Two reasons for this. One, I wanted to introduce something that did harm, because it's a conversation that we need to talk about, is talk about harms and talk about suffering and how that's linked and offset against benefit. But the act of doing that, so we talked about taking a sample that could be used for genotyping, or other tests that could be done on the mouse, but it was an act of doing something that harming something that you had cared for in a way that introduced a new nuance to it. In a very practical way, what it allowed us to do was to put a clip through the ear onto the mouse passport that people filled out next, because they kept getting separated. So very bad husbandry on our part. So that was a solution to that. So the mouse passport started off very simply, which was a way to continue the conversation and people to sort of put some ideas down. So it started off saying, name your mouse and then how you wanted your mouse to be looked after, and then it would have a unique code. So this was to build up our colonies. But then I realized as well that we could do more with this mouse passport, to ask different questions and kind of bring in other elements. So we extended the passport and to make it a bit more complicated, or a bit more in depth. So what we got was the name, the place of birth, the date of birth, the maker, its ID, the phenotype of what type of mouse we had made, and its character. So the character was a sort of, again, a device to have a conversation. So if someone put shy or cheeky, we could then say, so what would it be like to care for a mouse that is shy? What is it like to care for a mouse that is cheeky? And that sort of came into instructions for care, how people thought their mouse should be cared for. The box about who they thought would care for the mouse is about trying to find out how the public imagines animals are cared for, or who they think are in the laboratories. A lot of people just wanted it to be them. And then, so again, these are kind of other questions that sort of built in further narratives to the mouse and connecting it as an individual mouse and an individual thing. And then the next thing introduced was the infinity box. So I made these out of shoe boxes and backlit two-way mirrors. So after you'd made your individual mouse, and we'd talk about what it was like to care for that individual mouse, that individual character, putting it inside the infinity box, multiplied it. So you then have hundreds of mice, which we do in mice. So we're able to talk about caring at scale, and then what is complicated by that. And if the individual is lost in the multitude, and then how people would feel about having to care for so many. Can you do that? And who is doing that emotional labor? And is that sustainable? So all of these sort of built up. Each time we did this in a different iteration, we built a mouse colony. So we started before, when we started the exchange, the idea was people would maybe make a mouse, swap a mouse, leave a mouse, pick a mouse up and stuff, but people got very attached to it, and they wanted to keep it. And that's kind of what we wanted to do with the crafting material. It slows down time. And also, as a matter of concern and a matter of care, it's something to hold on to in a moment of comfort if you're having a difficult conversation. It's tactile and is a soft, comfortable thing. So we then introduced the fact that people had to leave them behind. So they were making a research mouse for this colony. So the colonies were hung up in these shoe racks with their passports. So people got to decide where it went in the colony, who it sat next to, and they would make the colony that was going to be used for research, like for that purposes, and they left it behind. And that again was to bring in a moment of anxiety, again, of people going to leave it and entrusting that they had given enough care instructions and leave it behind. So that is the mouse exchange, which if you're curious, there's the mouseexchange.org documents the research from the Southampton, how we developed it, all of those little sort of narrative tools are done, and all of the colonies are on there. So it's all of the passports that have all the stories of the mice and individuals, and then some of the conversations we had over the top of that. But we did that with family groups. I'll stop sharing now, which was great. So we did it with anyone down to 4-year-olds, and we did it up to kind of, like 8-year-olds, people stopping by, wondering what was going on, wanting to do some crafting. And a lot of people who sat down said, I never would have sat down and had a conversation about animal research, but this kind of drew me in. So, and that allowing for that kind of hospitality and for them to drive the conversation and for them to set the level of comfort means we had some extraordinary conversations in a way that was by them. I wanted to take that further in maybe a kind of adults only way. So this was around the time of kind of lockdown, and I was really curious about what the digital offers you in a way, as to use performance in a different way. And I would say this is all performance. This is sort of different sort of stages of theatre into what I was interested to bring to this as a process. I was also interested in moving beyond the hypothetical, like we had done in some of the elements of the mouse exchange. I was also kind of challenging myself to think, what is necessary for me to have to supply care as an infrastructure that allows me to do something else? And a way to sort of create intimacy between groups and a real connection, even over this digital divide. So because I made a very bold claim when we were talking about doing some of the work, that I said, I don't think it's difficult to do intimate moving stuff online. I think what's difficult is when you've done something in person and then you try to move it online. And then I thought, well, I guess I should probably try and demonstrate that. I was also really interested in the notion of betrayal and how betrayal sits with care, particularly within a professional identity of people who are seen to care. So what happens when people think they transcend that, or they do something that is uncaring? So I was interested in building in that moment within care. So it became Slow Ritual of Care, which is something that is done online like this over 2 workshops. So I'm going to try and shift settings now, and I will read the introduction that I give to the first workshop when people arrive, and then talk you through what happens in those workshops. And then we'll have the questions, and I'll be quiet. So I'll have some water first. Hello and welcome to the Slow Ritual of Care. Thank you so much for gifting me your time. I really appreciate it. And I hope to embody the workshop title and use this space to think and feel slowly and carefully together. And I would like to take a moment to settle us in. So this is a ritual of sorts, but not the type where only certain words can be spoken by specific people. All words are welcome here, as is silence. It is important to remember that silence is part of the natural architecture of discussion and decision-making. But that can feel very different online. Embrace it. There is no rush, obligation, or expectation for you to fill it. We should just enjoy our time together. So we'll be using our hands today, so that is a perfect place to start. And if you wish, you can join me in putting your hands together like this, fingerprints and palms touching. And then open them up like this and take a deep breath and exhale as you slowly close. And we can repeat that one more time, of taking in a breath and exhaling and letting go of any tension and expectations. Now, if we place our hands palm up, I'd like you to have a look at the lines here. And the top line is the heart line, and the one below that is the headline. And I would just like you to notice the distance between them, as if they were boundary lines. But now notice what happens to that space and those lines as we move and work with our hands. The space collapses and we bring those two orientations together. And that's the space I would like us to stay in for this workshop, between the head of what we know, the facts, an objective understanding, and then the heart, how we relate to that knowledge and how it makes us feel. So wonderful. I think we're now ready to begin. So that's the opening gambit, and then we talk about what has happened so far. So participants would have signed up for 2 workshops, and what should happen is I should get their addresses, and then a week in advance, one of these packs arrives on their door. So I'll talk you through the elements and kind of why I designed them and what they're meant to do. So this is my ritual design, which is my deconstructed mouse. And I chose this packaging because I wanted it to represent sort of a public imagination of animal research. So it is a presence, it's a burden, but you don't know what's inside. It's sort of an obelisk. You maybe want to look, you're curious, but you can't see until you sort of have permission to open it. We open this pack in the first workshop, and inside this is some different elements. So first of all, so I hand print and hand bind these books for everyone that is involved. So this is the reincarnation of the passport, but it's called Rituals for Care. So again, people fill out the name of the mouse, the date of birth, place of birth, colony, the character, instructions for care, etc. And they fill out that booklet after they've made the mouse. And this booklet we'll come to again. It's called Rights, and the first page is just for some notes, to keep notes of what they're doing. And they also sent inside a red envelope that we opened together. And inside that is the crafting materials. So there is a large felt circle, which becomes the body, some stuffing, which stuffs it, 2 small circles for ears, embroidery thread, and a needle, and these snippers for trimming everything off. And we make a mouse together. So we talk about what it's like to kind of, to make something, to form something, and that can be a body of knowledge or a body in itself. And I ask people if they've ever thought about where animals, research animals come from, or what they imagine to it. And we move through those conversations in a direction that people want to take. So sometimes I answer, it's all sort of, it's based on a dialogue, and there's no set agenda to where that goes or what that's do. It's just have a conversation. And again, adding the sensory organs to the mice, we can talk about what we think the mice overhear or what they sense or what they feel. So more about what they experience rather than what is done to them. And talking about what they can sense or what they hear also brings in conversations of who else could be in the lab and involved in these decisions and how people relate to them. So once we've made a mouse, people complete the rituals of care. And then also within the pack is another prepaid envelope. They put their mouse and that rituals of care in that envelope. And then this is the next step, they post it to the next individual. So the second workshop is 2 weeks later. So for that 2 weeks, a maker becomes a carer. So you care for someone else's mouse according to their instructions. In the second workshop, we normally have a core group. So I would say I only do this with small groups of people because it's about intimacy and it's about witnessing other people making something with care, and it's about witnessing other people's conversations and all being part of that. So it's about building a little intimate community. The second workshop, we normally open up to witnesses, silent witnesses, so other people can come who weren't involved in the first one, and then just witness the second the workshop. And I start that workshop by asking people, what they thought when that pack first came through the door, what it was like making the body. And then talking about making the body recalls the conversations that we had as we did different steps. So it's sort of like a built-in mnemonic about how we had those discussions, what has stayed with people. And then also that moment of what it felt like to send their mouse in the post and also receive a mouse and then be a carer. So I was really keen that we introduce the mice into the room. So that's the point where I ask people to introduce who they've been caring for. So they will introduce the mouse, read some of the instructions, and then talk about how they have interpreted that care. And that's normally directed at the maker to say, oh, this is how I've been looking after it. So we've got those two relationships. So we've built this, and then, so this is my moment, how we get to that. This is the moment of what I would term strategic betrayal. So we've had this conversation, and I come back to say, I would now like us to pause again and return to our hands. So if in this space between the head and the heart, and I would, sorry, I forgot a very key element to this. When they make the body in the very first workshop, inside this booklet, there is this little tag of paper. So they make a wish, they write down a wish, they roll it up and they place it inside the body of the mouse. So that's what they want this process to achieve and that mouse to achieve. Sorry, I forgot that. Now, flipping into the second workshop with the moment of betrayal, which I may have now ruined. So I'd like us now to pause again and return to our hands. And we have been in the space between the head and the heart. And I would like us to consider this line, the fate line, and explore where this crosses our head and our hearts. And I would like you as makers to think back to the wish that you made. And please do not share what that is, but please think about it coming true. Now, I would like to offer you a right to perform. There is a choice to make. This is completely optional. There is no wrong choice, but there is a choice and it is yours. You have the power to make someone else's come true, but to do that, you must read it aloud here in this ritual. You will need to unmake what you have been caring for, or you can choose to decline the wish. The choice is yours. Is there anything the makers would like to say to the carers? So this is the option to have someone's wish come true, so for the mouse to fulfill its purpose, but also to destroy the thing that you have been caring for. And then what comes is a negotiation between the makers and the carers about what should happen to the mouse. And I was interested in framing it this way, one, because I wanted to kind of recreate how people thought this conversation was negotiated in the laboratory, who gets a say to what is cared for, when care ends, and how far that goes, and who ultimately gets to say that. But also more widely in performances or creative practice or arts and health or more creative forms of research, the tensions between people, practitioners, artist practitioners or researchers, or the public, when interests diverge. So who all ultimately gets to make the decisions about what the fate of a project is. And if you're all caring for something, but want to take it in different directions. How do we negotiate that? So that was the larger kind of point of it. I've done this a few times. A couple of people have gone through and then destroyed the mouse and made the wish come true, which is, I would say, is an incredibly moving thing to watch. A lot of people automatically don't want to do it, but it's interesting to explore how people feel if they feel attached to the mouse that they made or the mouse that they have cared for, and who they think they can advocate for, and if they can ask someone to do something uncomfortable. And again, it's then looking at how we do that when we ask other people to commit acts of harm or do something that's harmful to them in part of a larger collaboration. So I talk about harms, and we do harm people, and we have to be honest about that. Academia and research, is quite a toxic place somehow. So it's thinking about all of these things and how it maps on. That was my kind of idea anyway, and that is the second bit. So I think I'll finish now so we can get to the questions by just reading how I close the second workshop after we've discussed this and sort of checked that everyone is okay. One thing before we go, I would like to say the other bit, and sorry, Susanna, this will ruin the surprise. The rights booklet is divided up into 3. It's tied off, so you can't open all of it. And then I contact participants and ask them to cut open and reveal what's inside those pages at stages after the second workshop. And inside that is a reflective practice. So it's based on a system called ORID that creative facilitators use, which starts on the sort of the objective facts of kind of what happened, then reflective and what you remember and how you felt about it, interpretive about what that means in your life, and then decisional about what you want to do about it. So it's a structured sort of intimate conversation that we continue on after the event. And then I always end up anything I do by saying, what else do you want to tell me? And then what else do you want to ask me? Just to make sure that we have ended well together. So that comes in. But this is how I end the workshop and how I'll end talking now. And maybe you can say if I've achieved this. So I'm interested in more than human worlds and more than human ethics. And I'm interested in welfare beyond suffering and in ethics beyond harm. And I wish to create spaces where ethics are enacted rather than performed. And I'm interested in becoming more than a witness, in heavy knowledge and the consequences of decision-making. I'm interested in the intensity of materiality and how it flickers between subject, object, and thing, but how there is no denying the burden of presence. And I want us to be attentive to every time a metaphor is used. For using a metaphor tells us we do not yet have the vocabulary to talk directly about something. So I can't talk to you about my life, it is too much. But I can talk to you about a river, and in telling you about that river, you understand the truth about my life, but at a distance from it. I'm interested in the ritual because it is a metaphor in action. It asks us to attend to the edges of ourselves. And we should remember that the witch knows she is powerful, whereas the layperson may only suspect. I'm interested in collapsing distances by offering radical hospitality so that we may stay longer together in our discomfort. Thank you for gifting me your time. I appreciate it deeply. I hope you have found the process nourishing, and most of all, thank you for caring.
Bentley, that is amazing. It also feels inappropriate to leap into a space when you've championed silence and slowness so beautifully. It's very rich, large topics that you're exploring, and so beautifully and thoughtfully done. If folk have questions, do please either put your hand up or put them in the chat. I'm going to hog the microphone briefly because I have lots of questions. I suppose the first one that came across, you mentioned the emotional labour of caring for animals and working with animals, and it strikes me that there's an enormous amount of emotional labour that you carry in running these workshops, and that and the relationship with the public, different publics that you work with. And I suppose, how have you developed your skill set around that, and how do you kind of look after yourself within that process?
It's a really good question. I don't know. There's definitely situations that I know how to cope with, but I may not yet have worked out how to flourish in them. And I think that comes from working very differently. And it's so with these practices, I always, to me, it's the participant that's the most important thing, and it's thinking about the participants, what they want to do and their emotional responses and what I'm asking of them. So I think about what agency I'm allowing them, how I'm casting them in a role, and what I'm asking that role to do, and attending to all of that. And I think sometimes when we talk about research or try and communicate research, it's really sort of focused on telling people things or talking about the research to them as that's the kind of gift, and flipping that. They're different kind of economies to work within, so navigating that can be really challenging. And so I don't think I have all of the answers. It's a very slow process that you can't sort of rush sort of developing these relationships. And sometimes, so I would say up to the point where I ask them if they want to make that wish come true, I wouldn't always do that. I would have a feeling. So, as you know, we cancelled the second slow ritual care. Well, I did it privately for various reasons. If I didn't think I could provide care, or if I didn't think I had created a space that was safe enough for me to betray people in, then I wouldn't do it. So I think it's just, I mean, I don't know. I think that's not very coherent.
No, what that makes me think about is sort of questions around control, power, authority, and disrupting those, pushing against those expectations, and by flipping it, there is a lot of trust that goes into that dynamic as well. Jana, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation. I'm really overwhelmed by the work that you've presented. And my question is about this project, but maybe also a bigger project. And it's really about how to end a workshop or a series of workshops like this with care. Because I mean, just listening to you, I can tell that you are holding these spaces with so much love and care, but then they also have to come to an end. And you are aware that you've brought up all these then deep issues. And how do you, in a sense, then let something end or conclude, knowing that even if it's a series of workshops, it has to come to an end? And I think maybe particularly in online spaces, it can be so hard to end these Zoom sessions. But I don't think it's just a question about online. I think the same issues arise if we were to meet in person. So it's really about ethically and in caring ways ending these really deeply sensitive projects.
It's an amazing question. So I feel I'm such a fan of your work. I should ask you how you do it, because I know you think about these things too. So I had an interesting conversation about moving online, and so again, I was really interested in kind of thinking as these little Zoom squares, like as performance spaces, and what that would mean. And I'm also aware that when we've done live sessions, so the big difference between online is when you do in-person settings, and the point is we set them up to be somewhere different, that people stumble across them, so they decide if they want to get involved. And you don't have that online. People don't stumble into an online space. You have to pre-book it and you have to do that. So that's a difficulty in how you make that invitation, and also ending to it. So I liken it to sort of dust. Maybe in the Pullman setting, maybe just literally human detritus, I guess. So in a physical setting, when you go to something, if you have a very charged or difficult conversation, that can settle on you, and you can feel bits of presence of it. But you leave that space and you go home, and some of that is going to blow off, and you kind of sometimes decide what to revisit. But to appear in someone's domestic space and then be like, here's all this heavy knowledge. It's a lot, isn't it? And then be like, oh, I'll see you later. is really abrupt. So I think that's why I wanted to bring in those, I guess, these artifacts of care that people still had that could refer back to. Like that's why they're all hand cut, hand printed, handwritten. It's about sharing that connection and that intimacy, and it's proof that we cared and we cared together. So even though it's ended, these kind of artifacts just say this was a process that we did together, that we co-produced together, and that you can go back to it. And it's sort of like a talisman to have it. So I think those little artifacts and stuff like that, that show some of the process, that hold some of the emotion that you had there, is a way towards doing that, if that's helpful.
Thank you, Jana. Until we have another question, I would like to ask, I'm very interested in creative process and how ideas developed. And you have this wonderful phrase, I wrote it down, we could do more. And I really like that you sort of revealed the iterative process of how this is being developed. And we could do more, we could do more. And what seems to drive each step of it is starting with the emotional response and then through metaphor exploring that. And I really liked how you spoke about metaphor at the end. I think about like the mask and theatre, that it's a step away to go deeper, sort of quite counterintuitive. So how instinctual is this process, or how much is this a very deliberate, conscious way of working that you've developed over time?
I think my work is always evolving, so I'm sort of become more curious about different things. So I think I'm really interested in the performance elements, and I'm really interested in, so I think I struggle with a lot of theory sometimes, because what I found, so my background is veterinary virology, so I come from a veterinary background, and what I always find funny, one of these tensions about researchers, especially in social science, is you know, if you have a conversation about it and then they're like, oh, you know, you should probably read these things, and then they were like, here's 8 books, like 8 books for you to go and read, and you're like, well, this is going to take me like the rest of the project. I'm a very slow reader, but you know, you get there in the end. But I think what performance artists are doing, and especially in the theatre, is they have an applied and an embodied sense of a lot of the really overwrought theoretical arguments that go on in like STS, in science and technology studies. And so I think maybe that's why I feel happier there, because I'm like, I like touching stuff and doing stuff, and that way of thinking within theory feels better to me. So instead of sort of thinking about how I would define effect or what I want to do with it, I kind of think about, you know, it as a tactile kind of element, as an actor in it, and what I want to do with it. I do always start in very basic terms with a rational aim. I mean, what I want this work to do. So what I want it to do and who I want to do it with, but then always an experiential aim of what I want doing that to feel like. And so sometimes that could be anxiety, because I don't think you can have honest conversations if you say, by the end of this, I will have resolved all of your concerns, because that's very didactic, because you don't even know what their concerns are. So resisting resolving things, leaning into ambiguity, and having more open spaces. You're not trying to correct or contain or solve. You don't get that tension and that pressure, because people feel they can share more in an emotional way. So however people want to respond, you can allow in that space. And I think that's why feeling in a performance way feels more like where I am. So that's kind of how I've ended up in the space and the tools that I'm using.
It's fascinating. I come from an art world background and working with artists, and the way that you speak, I would expect an artist to speak in the same way. It's a knowing through doing, it's a knowing through responding to materials, having sort of sensitive responses to people, and by doing a thing, you gain knowledge that you then feed back into the next time that you do it. And it's very grounded in that process.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean to say those processes aren't rigorous.
No.
Like that's the thing, and I think that's the struggle to some people understand. You can sense it when they're like, we'll get a creative involved, or sometimes they say, will you sprinkle a little bit of Bentley magic on it, like at the end of something, and I'm like, well no, because you know, the structures that you've built are completely not how I can work within. So, you know, it's being involved in the kind of long run of stuff, and also being prepared to have difficult conversations sometimes with people and walk away from things.
Bentley, that's where I live, working in gallery education, is being patted on the head, and can we just have a nice photo opportunity with the kids, and overlooking the kind of depth of thought and planning and consideration that goes into these things. Any final thoughts? Just because, okay, all right. So Bentley, thank you so much. Again, I sort of don't really want to go off on the other stuff to wrap the thing up, because I feel this is such a special space and the sort of transition feels a bit jarring. So thank you so much for your time and your contribution. And I'm sure everyone is going to have a lot to reflect on following your sessions. Thank you. And for our audience, just say thank you very much for joining us over these 3 days. And just to keep in mind that we have recordings of all of the sessions, and we've also had an illustrator capturing a visual diary of our Exchange Symposium. So we're going to be packaging that all up and sending that out in a couple of weeks' time, and so that you have a record and you can reflect on things if you haven't done so fully yet. And if you haven't joined our arts and culture mailing list, please do. There is always a lot going on, and we'd love to kind of keep in touch. And also, if you're doing any programming that you'd like to promote, we'd love to help you do that. And finally, we will be evaluating, because we're always evaluating, and so we've got a quick online how was it for you, and I think there will be a link in the chat, and also we'll be sending a follow-up email. So do please tell us what worked and what didn't work. We'd love to hear from you. And finally, I have my list here just to make sure, like the Oscars, I remember everyone. A huge number of people and a lot of time has gone into the last 3 days. So I would like to thank the project team and the associated contributors, as well as all the speakers. So Lindsay Anderson, Kate Baker, Lorna Barnes, Anna Bunt, Helen Gillespie, Naomi Glanville, Emma Lucas, Laura Miles Borgman, John Puckey, Steph Skates, Lois Spence, and Grace Williams. A huge thanks to all of you for your input. And now, yes, we will send you off into your weekends, hopefully bursting with thoughts and inspiration, and we will see you next time. So thank you very much. Cheers.